The chapel doors crashed open. Every head snapped toward the back of the room. A huge shape filled the doorway, and beside it stood a dog with one eye. The man staggered forward. His boots left mud across the white runner. Somebody screamed. The groom stepped in front of the bride and raised his fists. The stranger's beard was matted. His coat hung off him in strips. He lifted one cracked hand toward the woman in the wedding dress. Then he spoke 6 words that stopped the music dead. I haven't seen a woman in 10 years. The bouquet slipped from the bride's fingers and hit the floor because she knew that voice. She had buried that voice. His name was Elias Vance, and the Navy had called him dead a decade ago. What made her drop everything at the sound of a ghost? Stay with me on this one. Let me take you back. 10 years before that door crashed open, Elias Vance was just a welder in Cedar Falls, Montana. A quiet man, the kind who fixed your truck and never sent a bill. He worked the yard down by the rail line, and every evening he walked home along the river with his hands in his pockets. Cedar Falls was a small place. Everybody knew everybody. And everybody knew that Elias Vance was going to marry Delia Marsh. Delia taught music at the elementary school. She played piano at the church on Sundays. She had a laugh that carried across a room, and when she looked at Elias, the big quiet man went soft as bread. They had been together since they were 19. They met at a barn dance neither of them wanted to be at, and he stepped on her feet twice, and she laughed instead of pulling away, and that was that. Nobody in town could remember one without the other. Now here's the thing about Elias. Before the welding, before Delia, there had been another life. 8 years in the Navy. A SEAL team. He never talked about it. Not once. The medals stayed in a shoebox under the bed. When people asked, he changed the subject and offered them coffee. Delia had opened that shoebox exactly one time early on, and what she saw in there scared her enough that she closed it and never opened it again. She didn't marry the man in that box. She married the one who whistled in the yard. But the Navy has a way of calling men back. In the spring of 2004, a letter came. His old unit was short. They needed men who knew a certain stretch of mountains on the other side of the world, and Elias was one of the few still breathing who did. It was supposed to be 90 days, in and out. A favor to men he'd bled beside. Delia begged him not to go. They sat on the porch until 2 in the morning, and she held his hand so tight her knuckles went white. She said she had a bad feeling. She said she couldn't explain it, but she felt it in her chest like a stone. He kept saying 90 days. She kept saying she didn't care about the number. She cared about the door he'd walk out of and whether he'd walk back through it. Elias reached into his pocket and pulled out a small brass compass. It had belonged to his grandfather. He pressed it into her palm and folded her fingers over it. "Keep this," he told her, "so you always know which way I'm coming home." She started to cry. He wiped her face with his thumb and made her a promise. He said, "No matter what happens, no matter how long it takes, I will come back to you. If I'm breathing, I'm walking home. You have my word." Then he made her promise something too. He said, "And if I'm ever late, you wait for the man himself, not a letter. Not an officer at the door. You wait until you see my face. Because paper lies, Delia. Men lie, but I don't," she promised. She gave him back the compass and told him to carry it himself. "Bring it home," she said. He tucked it against his heart and said he already planned to. He left on a Tuesday. For 60 days the letters came. They were short. He was never a man of many words on a page, but every one of them ended the same way. "Which way is home, Delia?" And she'd write back and tell him, "West, always west." Then, on the 71st day, they stopped. A car with government plates pulled up outside the little house on River Street. 2 officers in dress uniform walked to the door. Delia was standing at the window. She saw them coming and she felt that stone in her chest turn to ice. There had been an ambush in the mountains. The unit was overrun. Most of the men were recovered. Elias Vance was not. He was listed as killed in action, presumed dead, no body, no remains. Just a folded flag they handed her on the porch and a word she would carry for 10 years. Gone. She did not scream. She just slid down the doorframe and sat on the floor and held that flag against her chest until the officers left. Then she sat there some more in the dark, long after their car was gone. For a year, she did not touch the piano. The town buried an empty casket up on the hill. They put his name on a stone. Delia visited it every Sunday after church, and every Sunday she told him the same thing. I'm still waiting. You said wait for the man himself, so I'm waiting. The years did what years do. People stopped saying his name. The casseroles stopped coming. Friends who had cried with her at the funeral started gently to nudge. It's been 5 years, Delia. It's been 7, he would want you to live. And every time she'd touch the empty place at her throat and say the same thing. He told me to wait for the man himself, so I'm waiting. They started to look at her the way you look at someone who's a little bit broken. She let them. She'd rather be a little bit broken and right than whole and wrong. Then, in the 6th year, a man came to town. Wade Coyle. He drove a nice truck and wore a nice coat, and he had a way of making a room feel warmer just by walking into it. He bought the old Henderson place and fixed it up. He gave money to everything that needed money. And slow, patient, kind, he set his sights on the prettiest, saddest woman in Cedar Falls. He was good at it, too. He never pushed, he'd just be there. He fixed the leak in the school roof where she taught. He sat in the 3rd pew every Sunday and told her after that nobody played that old hymn the way she did. It took him 3 years to get Delia to say yes. She only did because everyone she trusted told her it was time, because a woman cannot hold a candle for a ghost forever, because the man himself was never ever coming home. That's what they told her, and she almost believed it. Almost. The night she said yes, she went out to the porch alone and sat where they'd sat, and she said out loud to nobody, I'm sorry. And she waited for the stone in her chest to answer. It didn't. She decided that meant permission. It didn't. But 10 years is a long time to wait for a dead man. And this summer, everything changed. Here's what nobody in Cedar Falls knew. Elias Vance did not die in those mountains. When the ambush hit, he was thrown down a ravine by the blast. He broke 2 ribs and cracked his skull, and he lay under a shelf of rock while men with rifles walked the ridge above him, looking for bodies to finish. He stayed still for 11 hours. He counted his own breaths to stay awake. He got to a number he doesn't like to say. When they finally left, he crawled. He crawled for 3 days before a herder found him and hid him in a barn. The man spoke no English. Elias spoke none of his language. But the old herder fed him goat's milk and set his ribs, and when soldiers came through, he buried Elias under straw and lied to their faces. Elias never learned why the old man risked his life for a stranger. He just knew that he owed a debt he could never pay to a man whose name he never got. I'll spare you the long version. It took Elias 2 years to get out of that country. He crossed borders on foot. He worked in the hold of a cargo ship. By the time he could have made a phone call, something in him had gone very quiet and very careful, because he had learned a hard thing over there. He had learned that the ambush was not bad luck. Somebody had sold his unit's position. Somebody on the contractor side, the men who ran the intelligence, had traded that mountain pass for money. Elias had heard the name whispered in a prison cell by a man who had no reason to lie. The man was dying. He'd been part of it and it had eaten him alive, and he wanted to hand the weight to somebody before he went. And when a soldier learns his own people got him killed, he stops trusting the phone. He stops trusting the door. He decides to come home the long way on his own feet and look every man in the eye before he says a word. That is why it took him 10 years. He came across the top of the world. He worked fishing boats out of the Aleutians. He spent 2 winters alone in a cabin in the Alaskan interior, and that is where he found the dog. A Malamute pup, half frozen, one eye clawed out by something bigger than it. Elias thought it against his chest and named it Juno. From that day on, the dog never left him. Through every mile of the walk south, through Yukon snow and British Columbia rain, Juno walked at his heel. On the worst nights, when the cold got into Elias' cracked skull and made him see things that weren't there, it was the dog's steady breathing that told him which way was real. By the summer of 2014, he was thin and gray and hard as a fence post, but he was on Montana ground. And on a warm Saturday afternoon, Elias Vance walked down the main street of Cedar Falls for the first time in 10 years, with a one-eyed dog beside him and a brass compass in his coat pocket. Nobody knew him. That was the strange part. He walked right past men he'd gone to school with, and they looked straight through him. The beard, the weight he'd lost, the way he carried himself now. He was a stranger in his own town. He stopped once across the street from the little house on River Street and looked at it a long time. There was a strange truck in the drive. He made himself keep walking. He stopped at the hardware store. Old Merle was behind the counter, same as ever. Elias put a candy bar down and asked, quiet, if the Marsh family still lived on River Street. Merle looked at him funny. Delia Marsh, he said. Well, she won't be a Marsh much longer. Getting married today. Right now, matter of fact, up at the chapel on the hill. Half the town's up there. Elias went very still. Married, he said, to who? Fella named Wade Coyle, Merle said. Came to town 6 years back. Good man, real generous. Put money into the school, the Veterans Hall, all of it. Been courting Delia a long while. Nobody blamed her for saying yes. Girl waited long enough for a ghost. Elias set the candy bar down and walked out without his change. He did not run. A man who has walked 10,000 miles does not run the last one. He climbed the hill toward the White Chapel, and Juno climbed beside him, and with every step something was tightening in his chest. Because that name, Wade Coyle, meant nothing to Merle, but it meant everything to Elias. He had heard it once before, in a cell, from a dying man. Wade Coyle was the contractor who had sold the pass. Elias reached the top of the hill. Through the chapel windows he could see them all, the flowers, the candles, Delia in white at the front, more beautiful than his memory had let him keep. And beside her, in a gray suit, a broad-shouldered man with a politician's smile. The organ began to play. Elias put his hand on the door, and you know what happened next. The doors crashed open. The whole town turned. He said his 6 words and the bouquet hit the floor. Now here is where you'd expect it all to go wrong. But it didn't. Not yet. For a long moment nobody moved. Then a woman in the second row gasped his name, half a question. An old man stood up slowly, squinting. Somebody said, Is that Elias Vance? The words moved through the room like a wind through wheat. And Delia came down off the step, slow, one hand over her mouth. She crossed the whole length of that chapel while 500 eyes watched, and she stopped a foot in front of the ragged stranger, and she looked into his eyes, past the beard and the dirt and the 10 hard years. Somebody brought him a glass of water. He took it in a shaking hand. A deacon guided him to sit on the front pew. People were crying now, smiling, reaching to touch his shoulder like he was a miracle come in from the road. The organ had stopped. The panic had drained out of the room. It felt for one warm moment like the impossible had simply become a homecoming. Delia knelt in front of him. She whispered, Is it really you? And Elias almost let himself believe it was over, that he'd made it, that he was home. He should have known better. Then the groom spoke. Wade Coyle had come down the aisle behind Delia. He put a hand on her shoulder, gentle, and he said in a smooth, steady voice, Easy now. This poor man is clearly not well. Look at him. Whoever he is, he needs a hospital, not a wedding. And Elias lifted his head and looked at Wade Coyle full in the face for the first time. The warmth went out of the room like water down a drain, because Elias smiled. A cold, terrible smile. And he said, Hello, Wade. I've been walking a long time to find you. Wade's hand tightened on Delia's shoulder. His smile stayed, but his eyes changed. "I don't know this man," Wade said to the crowd. "I've never seen him in my life." "That's a lie," Elias said, and he stood up. "Here's the thing about a room full of people. They can feel a shift before they understand it. A second ago this was a ghost story with a happy ending. Now 2 men stood 6 feet apart and one of them had gone pale under his tan. Elias turned to the whole town and he told them. He told them about the mountains, about the ambush, about how his unit walked into a pass that somebody had sold. He told them he'd spent 10 years getting home, and how in a prison cell on the other side of the world, a dying man had given him a name. The name of the contractor who took the money, Wade Coyle. The chapel was dead silent. Wade laughed. He actually laughed. "This is insane," he said. "This man is a drifter. He's sick. He read my name in the paper. He saw a wedding. He wants money. Delia, honey, don't listen to this." And for a second it worked. Because who was this stranger? A beard and a dog and a wild story. And Wade Coyle had spent 6 years buying this town's love with a checkbook. He'd paid for the roof on this very chapel. Half the people in the pews owed him something. You could see them wanting to believe the easy thing. It's a hard fact about people. They'll take the smooth lie over the ugly truth 9 times out of 10 because the lie lets them keep their afternoon. Delia stood between them, shaking. That was the moment it stopped being a love story, because now it wasn't just about who she'd marry. It was about a man who had bought a whole town, married the widow of the soldier he'd betrayed, and could bury the truth again just by smiling. Elias had walked 10,000 miles and he was about to lose to a checkbook. He had no proof, just his word. And his word in that room was the word of a stranger. Wade saw it too. He saw the doubt in the crowd and he pushed. He said, "Someone call the sheriff." This man broke into a private ceremony. "He's dangerous. Look at that animal with him." 2 big men stood up from the pews, friends of Wade's, and started down the aisle. Elias did not back up. He reached into his coat. The 2 men froze, thinking weapon. But it wasn't a weapon, it was the compass. He held it up so the whole room could see it. Old brass dented, the glass cracked. And he looked at Delia and he said, "You gave me this on the porch. You told me to bring it home. You made me promise you'd wait for the man himself. Not a letter, not an officer, the man." Delia's knees buckled because nobody knew about that compass. Nobody. It had been a private thing between the 2 of them on a dark porch 10 years gone. She had never told a soul. Not her mother, not Wade. She whispered, "Turn it over." He turned it over. On the back, scratched into the brass with a nail, were 2 letters. E and D. He'd carved them the night before he shipped out. And the whole wall came down at once. Delia looked at Wade. Then she looked at Elias. And her face broke open, 10 years of grief and hope pouring out in a single breath. She knew, beard or no beard, ghost or no ghost, she knew this was the man she had buried. If you're still with me, if you want to see how this ends, hit that subscribe button and stay to the finish. Because this is where it turns, trust me. Now, Wade Coyle was a cornered man, and cornered men are the most dangerous kind. He saw the town turning. He saw Delia's face. And he reached inside his own gray jacket. This time it was a weapon, a small pistol right there in the house of God. "Nobody move," Wade said, and his politician's smile was gone for good. Screams tore through the chapel. People dropped behind pews. Somebody's mother pulled 2 children to the floor. Wade had the gun on Elias, but his eyes kept flicking to the doors, to the crowd, to Delia. He was doing the math. He had bought this town, but you can't buy your way out of a gun in a church full of witnesses. He'd panicked and he knew it, and panic makes a man do worse things. "Get back," Wade said, "all of you. Delia, come here now." And Delia said one word, "No." Now here's something Wade Coyle did not know. He did not know that for 2 winters, a one-eyed Malamute had learned to read the exact moment a man's shoulders go tight before violence. Juno had been standing at the back this whole time, silent, watching. And when Wade swung the gun toward Delia, the dog moved. 90 pounds of Alaskan Malamute came down that aisle in 3 strides and hit Wade Coyle at the wrist. The gun went off once into the ceiling, plaster rained down, and then it was skittering across the floor and Wade was screaming with a dog's jaws locked on his arm. Elias crossed the space in a heartbeat. 10 years of hard walking, 8 years of training that never really leaves a man. He put Wade Coyle on the floor and held him there, calm, almost gentle, a knee in his back. "Easy," Elias said quietly. "It's over." The sheriff came through the doors then, gun drawn, called by somebody's phone, and for a bad second he didn't know who to point it at. The ragged stranger or the town's most generous man. But now Elias had something more than his word. He nodded to his coat. "Inside pocket," he said. "Take it out." The sheriff reached in and pulled out an oilcloth packet wrapped tight, carried 10,000 miles. Inside were papers. A photograph, cracked and faded, of Wade Coyle in another country, in another life, shaking hands with men the whole world had a name for, and a page of coordinates and dates in Wade's own handwriting. The dying man in the cell had not just given Elias a name. He'd given him the proof, smuggled out of a prison, because he wanted to die with one clean thing done. The pass that got Elias Unit killed was on that page. So was Wade Coyle's signature. The sheriff looked at the photograph. He looked at the man in the dog's teeth, and he holstered his gun and reached for his handcuffs instead. They pulled Juno off. They cuffed Wade Coyle and stood him up, and the man who had bought a whole town looked around at once and saw not a single friend. The people he'd paid for. They all just stared at him like he was something they'd scraped off a boot. They took him out the side door, and then the chapel went quiet. That kind of quiet you could hold in your hand. Elias stood up slow. His knees hurt. His hands were shaking again, but not from fear now. He turned around and there was Delia, 10 years. She stepped over the fallen flowers in her white dress, and she didn't stop this time. She put both hands on his ragged face, and she looked at him the way you look at the sun after a long winter. "You came back," she said. "I told you I would," he said. "If I'm breathing, I'm walking home." "You're late," she whispered, and she was laughing and crying at the same time. "I know," he said. "I'm sorry. It was a long way." And Delia Marsh, in front of the whole town in the dress she'd bought to marry another man, kissed the man she had buried 10 years before. She kissed him hard, both hands in his beard, and the whole chapel came apart with the sound of 500 people weeping and cheering at once. Now the preacher was still standing there. Old Reverend Hollies, who had christened them both as babies, who had buried an empty casket with Elias' name on it. He was crying too, wiping his glasses on his sleeve. And Delia turned to him, still holding Elias' hands, and she said, "Reverend, we already waited 10 years. I'm not waiting one more day." The chapel went still. She looked up at Elias. "Will you," she said, "right now, just like this." And the big quiet man who had crossed the top of the world on his own 2 feet looked down at the only thing he'd ever walked toward, and he said, "That's the only reason I came home." So Reverend Hollies, with his hand still shaking, married them, right there. A ragged man in a torn coat and a woman in a wedding dress meant for somebody else, standing in fallen flowers, with a one-eyed dog sitting at their feet like he'd planned the whole thing. There were no rings. So Elias took the brass compass, warm from his pocket, and he pressed it into her hand the same way he had on the porch 10 years before. This time neither of them let it go. "You may kiss the bride," the Reverend said, though she already had. He kissed her anyway. They didn't have a reception. Nobody had planned for this one. The town just sort of stayed. They pushed the flowers back into place. Somebody found a bottle of whiskey in a truck, and somebody else had a fiddle, and by evening the chapel on the hill had turned into the strangest, happiest party Cedar Falls had ever seen. People kept coming up to touch Elias' arm, just to be sure he was real. Wade Coyle was in a cell by nightfall. Over the next months, the truth came out slow and ugly. Federal men came to Cedar Falls with briefcases. That photograph and those coordinates opened a door that led a long way up. It turned out Wade Coyle had gotten a lot of men killed, not just one unit in one pass. He'd made his fortune on it, and then he'd come to a quiet mountain town to disappear behind a smile and a checkbook. Marrying Delia had been the final touch, the perfect cover. Who would ever suspect the generous man who'd married a fallen soldier's grieving girl? He never smiled in a courtroom. He went away for the rest of his life. The money he'd poured into Cedar Falls, the school and the hall and the chapel roof. The town voted to keep it and put up a plaque that didn't have his name on it. It had the names of the men who died in that pass instead. Elias asked them too. As for Elias and Delia, they moved into the little house on River Street, the same one with the porch. She went back to teaching music. He went back to welding, and old Merle at the hardware store still owed him change he never did collect. He didn't talk much about the 10 years. Now and then Delia would wake in the night and find the bed empty, and she'd come out to the porch and find him sitting there with Juno's big head in his lap, just looking at the dark. She never asked him what he saw out there. She'd just sit down beside him and take his hand and wait. She was good at waiting. She'd had practice. Slowly, the quiet man came back to life. It didn't happen all at once, but there were mornings she'd hear him whistling in the yard, and evenings he'd laugh at something on the porch, a real laugh, the one she'd thought was buried in those mountains with everything else. The man who'd walked home a ghost was becoming, day by day, just a man again. Her man, that was enough, that was everything. The compass sits on the mantel now, the glass is still cracked. Delia never had it fixed. She says a thing that carried a man 10,000 miles home has earned the right to look its age. There's a photograph on the mantel too, next to the compass. It's the only picture anybody thought to take that day. Delia in her white dress with dirt on the hem. Elias in his torn coat, thin and gray, a stranger's beard on a face she'd have known anywhere. And down in the corner, a one-eyed dog looking straight at the camera. It's not a pretty wedding photo. It's the most beautiful thing in that house. Ask anyone who's seen it. Juno lived 4 more good years. He died old and warm by the wood stove, one eye and all, and Elias buried him up on the hill, not far from the stone that used to have Elias' own name on it. They took that stone down, by the way. Elias watched them do it. He said it was a strange thing to stand over your own grave and feel the sun on your face. People in Cedar Falls still tell this story. They tell it at weddings mostly. When some young couple stands up nervous at the front of that same chapel, some old-timer in the back always leans over and says, you know, a dead man walked through those doors once. And whoever's listening says, come on, that's not true. And the old-timer just smiles and says, ask Delia Vance. She married him. Here's the part they always end on. Remember the doors. Remember how this whole thing started, with those chapel doors crashing open and a ragged stranger filling the frame while a whole town turned to stare in fear. Every year on their anniversary, Elias and Delia walk back up that hill. They open those same doors, but slow now, gentle, and they stand in the empty chapel where a broken man came home, and where a promise made on a porch outlived a war, a lie, and 10 silent years. He always says the same thing to her in that empty room. The same 6 words that stop the music dead. I haven't seen a woman in 10 years, and every year she gives him the same answer. She takes his weathered face in both her hands and she says, well, you're looking at her now, and you're not going anywhere. He never did. 10 years he walked. Nothing but a dog and a compass and a promise. And every single mile of it, he was walking home.